Palestinians and their double identity and how that plays into their oppression. So we can start off just to give some historical context on Palestine and on colonial violence within the Palestinian struggle. Should I start over there? Or do you do it?
I think you should.
Yeah, all right.
You should control it from back here.
So, starting off on a brief introduction onto the colonial violence that began with the occupation of Palestine into what formed into the legal Zionist state of Israel. During the 1948 commencement of the Nakba and the years leading up to it, approximately 15,000 Palestinians were killed as a result of massacres committed by Zionist gangs. One particular famous massacre was in Dar Yassin, where Irun and Stern gang Zionist militias killed 107 Palestinians, mainly unarmed women, children, and elderly. This was a very famous massacre that occurred during the months leading up to the 1948 resolution that split historically occupied Palestine into Palestine and Israel, allotting about 60% of the land to the Zionist state and the remaining 40% to the Palestinian state, or to how they divided it up. They wish to divide it up ethnically, so, referring to them as the Jewish state and the Arab state. And that number of 107 Palestinians is disputed. It's between about 100 Palestinians to 250 Palestinians that were killed and murdered during this massacre. And this was a particularly important massacre that happened. There were up to tens, about to 80, 100 massacres that occurred during this period. But this one was one that became very widespread and known during that time in the area, and that was a very big cause for the Nakba, and was the reason why so many Palestinians ended up leaving and fleeing their villages, because they heard about this massacre, and it prompted them to leave to be able to seek safety. Even though this was committed by Irun and Stern gang Zionist militias, these Zionist militias ended up eventually forming the IDF. And so this was not a ragtag group of people. This was a deliberately organized plan. It was known as Operation Nashot, and it was authorized by David Ben-Gurion, who I believe ended up becoming the Prime Minister of Israel. And it was part of Plan de Lot, which was a wider ethnic cleansing campaign that was organized by the newly initiated Zionist regime, as they knew that they were going to install and input the 1948 resolution. And this kind of shows the origins of the Zionist regime and how it came about, being that it came about as a militarized, somewhat fascist regime that was predicated on the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people within the area. People reported, mass kidnappings, mass rapes, mass murders during all of these massacres. People who were taken prisoner were brutally starved or brutally kept in harsh conditions. So this was very much a campaign that was based off of the targeted killings of indigenous Palestinians. One of the things that you'll see later on in the video that we play is a quote saying that for the colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and above all dignity. So there is a very documented link between indigenous people and the land that occupiers have historically been very much able and focused on taking advantage of being able to sort of deprave and oppress the indigenous people by attacking the land and that which gives them material resources and material goods. So a symbolic sort of crop within Palestinian history and agriculture is the olive tree. So more than 800,000 olive trees have been uprooted by settlers since 1967 alone. That is because the olive tree is a way in which Palestinians find autonomy through their own self agricultural preservation, through use for their own cultural means, by producing foods and goods that they are able to sell. These olive trees have been in Palestine for up to 4,000 years. So one of the things that Zionists love to say in terms of their claim to the land is that they have an indigenous claim to the land, but one of those contradictions is having to contend with the fact that through their settling on the land, they have caused environmental havoc to the agricultural crops as well as to the land itself. Raising of agricultural fields, introduction of European invasive species, and destruction of water wells and sources is just one of the very few many things that have been used as a way of creating just exploiting the land and preventing from Palestinians to remain autonomous off of their own land. And more sort of examples of environmental violence is that since November of 1967, the issuance of Military Order 158 has prohibited the construction of water installations without first obtaining a permit from the Israeli occupation forces. So this has resulted in a complete restriction on Palestinians to drill new water wells, install pumps, as well as being denied access to springs. Some 880 communities in the West Bank remain without access to running water due to Israel's destruction of cisterns. So it's extremely hard to obtain a permit to drill for water and to gain access to water. Wells that are found within the Jordan River and natural springs that surround the West Bank, Palestinians have not been able to gain access to that, and they've been denied access to that. A common thing that the Israeli military loves to do is they like to attack cisterns that collect natural rainwater, and they destroy those cisterns so that Palestinian families are not able to gain access. There is a water production company called Makorva. That's an Israeli company that siphons water from the West Bank for the illegal settlements that Zionist settlers have been creating along the West Bank to provide to the Zionist settlers, and taking away water from indigenous Palestinians, who then have to resort to having to pay expensive prices for water through water trucks that go between their villages. So that's just another way that, especially since 1967, you see a very large concerted effort from the Israeli government to deny resources and to gain control, especially over water within these areas. A common thing that you'll hear from the Israeli military and just Israeli propaganda in general is them saying that they turned what was a desert into fertile land, which is funny considering that area is considered part of the Fertile Crescent. It's very fertile land within itself, but it's seen mass destruction and drought to the lands because of overexploitation of the lands and destruction of the lands, environmental destruction through pesticides, through just taking away water usage for private individuals and settlers. So those are all a bunch of ways in which you can say that was colonial violence. Colonial violence weaponized by the state to subjugate, oppress, and alienate the indigenous populations. And this is a quote that you will see in the upcoming video. Decolonization is a historical process. It cannot be understood. It cannot become clear to itself except by the movements which give it historical form and context. Decolonization was set out to change the order of the world is obviously a program of complete disorder, but it cannot come as a result of magical practices, nor of a natural shock, nor of a friendly understanding. So essentially what we find throughout decolonial movements in history is the necessary use of violence against the colonial systems, because any of you have ever read Merchant of the Earth by Franz Fanon, there is sort of a psychological component of being oppressed through colonial violence and always being the receiving end of such violence. And through violence is a way of reattaining and regaining that power amongst against people and oppressors who would otherwise dehumanize and would deprive you of your most basic moral human rights. So there is a lot of, we see like rhetoric and propaganda regarding moral sensibilities on violence, but at the same time, we see a lot of sanitizing of Israeli violence, of colonial violence as a means of self-defense. And essentially decolonization is a violent process, but there is a sort of historical context in which violence serves as a means of gaining one's freedom and one's achieving one's goals in national liberation. This was a report that was recently released I think today or yesterday by Hamas media news outlets regarding their reasons for the Operation Al-Aqsa flood and why they carried it out. And they give historical context and means from the beginning of 1948, the way the land was split unevenly, the way that it was a colonial project by Britain and by the West in order to have a friendly, somewhat, neighbor outpost within the Middle East, as well as being able to still create a neo-colonial structure within the area. And they do report that from January 2000 to September 2023, there was an estimated 11,299 Palestinians that were killed and over 156,000 injured. And compared to Israeli, because within like modern Western news outlets, you do see a lot of I think prioritizing Israeli lives that have been killed while neglecting the mass disproportionate difference between Palestinians and Israelis who actually are at any real risk of fear or of harm or danger. And just the mass amount of Palestinians that have been killed simply for walking across the street, for arguing with the soldier who is enforcing a colonial racist ruling over them. And, even to put further, they've, brought up mentions of peaceful protests, such as the Gaza 2018 Great March of Return, in which 360 Palestinians were killed. This was a peaceful protest of civilians who did not carry any weapons, who merely just marched to protest their continued displacement, their continued bombing from the Israeli regime. And meanwhile, occupation forces killed 360 Palestinians while injuring far more during the peaceful protests. So even with means of peaceful means of protest and against the Israeli regime, it has been shown over and over again that that will be met with even greater violence to disrupt any type of unity between Palestinian people as they uprise against their oppressors. And that is it for this presentation. We are going to go ahead and show you a short video that contains some of those clips and that gives a greater meaning into some of the sort of rationale behind violence in a decolonial process.
national liberation, national renaissance, the restoration of nationhood to the people. Whatever may be the headings used or the new formulas introduced, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. Decolonization is a historical process. It cannot be understood, it cannot become clear to itself, except by the movements which give it historical form and content. Decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. But it cannot come as a result of magical practices, nor of a natural shock, nor of a friendly understanding.
Well, a conflict.
It's not a conflict. It's a liberation movement fighting for justice.
Well, whatever it might be best called.
It's not whatever, because this is where the problems start. Because this is what makes you answer all your questions, ask you all your questions. This is exactly where the problems start. This is a people who is discriminated, is fighting for his rights. This is the story. If you will say it's a civil war, then your questions will be justified. If you will say it's a conflict, then of course it's a surprise to know what's happening.
Why won't your organization engage in peace talks with the Israelis?
You don't mean exactly peace talks, you mean capitulation, surrendering.
Why not just talk?
Talk to whom?
Talk to the Israeli leaders.
That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean?
Well, if there were no swords and no guns in the room, you could still talk.
No, I had never seen any talk between a colonialist case and a national liberation movement.
But despite this, why not talk?
Talk about what?
Talk about the possibility of not fighting.
Not fighting for what?
Not fighting at all, no matter what for.
Yeah, and people usually fight for something and they stop fighting for something. So you can't tell me even why should we speak about what?
Well, stop fighting.
Or talk about stop fighting why?
Talk to stop fighting, to stop the death and the misery, the destruction, the pain.
The misery and the destruction and the pain and the death of whom?
Of Palestinians, of Israelis, of Arabs.
Of the Palestinian people who are uprooted, thrown in the camps, living in starvation, killed for 20 years, and forbidden to use even the name Palestinians.
They're better that way than dead, though.
Maybe to you, but to us, it's not. To us, to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, to have our mere human rights, is something as essential as life itself.
For a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and, above all, dignity.
وحضني على أرض صامدة لآخر نقطة دم في روحي لآخر نفس فيا لما يعني خلص هيك يبطل فيا نفس أنا خليك أموت بعديها بندفن حتى في أرضي بندفن تحت الزراعة في أرضي بدي أنا أزرع أنا
ما بدك تسيبي أرضك بالمرة
بالمرة
إنك هلأ كتير بردانة ويمكن جوعانة وما في أدوية والوضع صعب برضو مش هتطلعي؟
برضو مش هطلع حضرنا صامدين
هالقد بتحبي فلسطين؟
هالقد أطفال فلسطين ما بتخلوش عنها زي ما حكت الأغنية أنا دمي فلسطيني أنا دمي فلسطيني.
So when you see our children of 4 or 6 or 8 saying the time's about up and it's about time we were free on this earth, you know we mean it. Yeah, we mean it. Yeah, we're going to get some freedom very soon now. In about 100 years. 100 years in 1963 since they promised us up in 1863. We're not full citizens yet, as I say, to the point where children of 4 and 6 have to bear the burden. But when you get a people where the children of 6 and 8 are ready to bear it, you know, there's not much time waiting there.
خافش من
من الجبنة ما خافش منهم زي الفيران يعني معاهم سلاح ومعاهم دبابات يمكن يتزروكوا بين الدبابات خايفين منا إحنا يعني مدنيين بس هم إرادتهم ضعيفة خوفهم لدرجة الجنون يعني مش طبيعي عندهم الخوف إحنا ما بنخاف منهم مش هو ما عملوا فينا ما بنخاف منهم أسلحتهم نزلت علينا زي المي لأنها نزلت من إيدين فاشلة نزلت من إيدين خايفة من إيدين مرخية
Nós vemos que o inimigo ultimamente intensificou a ação psicológica contra as nossas populações. Esta ação psicológica inimiga consiste basicamente no uso maciço ou massivo dos aviões de bombardeamento que lhe foram oferecidos pelos países da NATO, designadamente os aviões de reação a jato Fiat.
وهذه معلومة ربما ليست يعني تكشف للمرة الأولى. معظم تسليح المقاومة بمعنى التسليح الذي استهدفنا به العدو الصهيوني أو على الأقل دعني أتحدث عنه في كتاب الشرع المصطفى معظم تسليح المقاومة مصنع بأيدي فلسطينية بمعنى نحن نحارب نطلق صاروخ نصنع صاروخ. تمام. العدو الصهيوني وهذه معلومة معروفة وسائدة معظم التكنولوجيا العسكرية الصهيونية هي تجميع شركة رافائيل للصناعات العسكرية. شركة الصناعات العسكرية الإسرائيلية الصهيونية رافائيل تجمع تأتي بالتكنولوجيا الرقمية بالتكنولوجيا العالية من دول العالم وتصنعها بمعنى عندما يطلقون تجاهنا صاروخ يطلقون تجاهنا قذيفة يحلقون بطائرة ما إلى ذلك هم يحتاجون إلى جسر جوي من حلفائهم في الغرب يزودون بذلك نحن نقاتل على أرضنا ظهرنا إلى شعبنا وسلاحنا.
So, we're going to have another presentation shortly that's sort of going to connect the arms trade sort of that Israel has created and supported within the West and how they help to facilitate suppressing resistance movements within Africa, and so therefore why Africa as a continent and its people also have great links and solidarity with the Palestinian struggle and how they're all interconnected. And I guess overall the point of this whole, presentation that we're putting on isn't just for us to teach people, it is to create political education for people, but it's also for people to connect with one another and to organize with one another, to be aware of different groups and different organization groups that you can become a part of, because, living in the United States, we live in the belly of the beast, right? Like Oviatt Systems is one of the main Israeli manufacturer companies, and they have their headquarters right here in LA. So we have so much ability and power. We were so well organized. We were able to become organized and to struggle together. Unfortunately, with the U.S. and the past history of COINTELPRO and just reactionary movements within the U.S. and state government, that's been very much suppressed along with our political education. So that's how we want to start out there. But we really do recommend that people get to know one another. After this presentation, we'll have a discussion, followed by some videos, and then we'll have a break before we go into a Walker documentary on the Yom Kippur War. So we want to end here around 6:30 or so. But during the documentary, you don't need to be here or stay till the very end if you don't want to. We recommend people going outside to talk to one another, to get to know people around here better, what organizations you may come from, organizations people may hear of. If you have any questions about the A-APRP or how to get involved, we absolutely recommend coming up to one of us and talking to us. But we don't say that you necessarily need to exactly just join the A-APRP. It's just about joining an organization and being a part of it. So, but without further ado, I'm going to introduce my coworker or colleague, Kingsley. He is going to show us a presentation on the Israeli connection towards arms trades, as well as their role in suppressing liberation movements in the African continent. So.
Hello everyone, my name is Ogadima Kingsley Okapu. I am part of the A-APRP, the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And today I will be giving a presentation on connecting African and Palestinian struggle, the common struggle against Zionism, and some of the examples of solidarity with Africans and Palestinians.
So I'm a second generation of scholars from Chad. We need to report that it's not on the map. And usually if you go to this kind of gathering here,
Of course not.
so the first generation are from Chad, Nigeria, Sudan. They came from Mecca, so they are Jerusalem. Stayed here, began to marry from the Palestinian side. So for that, they are
Palestinian, yes sir.
About 40 families in both sections.
Yeah.
Which is in the center of most of the world.
I see.
Now, it's really important to have an idea what the way we are living as Palestinians and the way we are living in Israel.
Yes sir.
As Palestinians, we are saying we are privileged. We are well accepted, respected, and many brothers who are Palestinians. We never felt discriminated.
I see.
And I think this has to do with our contribution in the national system. Swelling the African community, certainly this week always, among the avant-garde.
Yeah.
For example, if you take the first Palestinian female to be put in Israeli jails in 1967, came from the African culture.
Oh wow.
I'm talking about Sister Fatima Barnoud.
Sister Fatima
In 1967, she was sentenced 30 years, which she was 11 years. Deported, she came back in 1994 as Chairman Arab. Today she's the chief of the Palestinian police.
Oh, nice!
Palestinian Authority. Now me, myself, together with my cousin, were arrested in 1968, also for contribution in the national republic. I was sentenced 20 years, of which I was 17 years.
Oh, wow.
In 1968, I was released in 1985, immediate change of prison. Now, our relation with the Israelis is totally different.
Okay.
Usually when I sit with Palestinians, I say to them, okay, brothers, you are oppressed, but me.
I'm not oppressed. Let me want to focus the camera on you, because me, I'm not interested. So. Okay.
But we as Afro-Palestinians, we are double oppressed. First, as Palestinians, second, because of our color. They call us pushy, liberals.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised because discrimination and racism in this process. So I'm a second generation of African.
Also mentioned Zionism and said that some of our young people in the Persian Gulf may not understand the role that Zionism is playing in this conflict. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Unfortunately, they don't know what Zionism is, but Zionism is a political philosophy which has brought about the state of Israel, the so-called state of Israel. This political philosophy has nothing to do with religion. On the contrary, it seeks to confuse others and let them think that Zionism and Judaism is one and the same. I am a conscious African. I know properly my history. I know that Africa gave Judaism to the world. I know that the first Jews in the world were Africans. Not only do I know this, but I inform everyone who has doubts about it to read a book by Sigmund Freud entitled Moses and Monotheism as a beginning. Consequently, I know that Judaism and Zionism are not the same. Zionism had its first organizational expressions in 1897 in Bâle, Switzerland, in Europe. Here was a man by the name of Theodor Herzl, H-E-R-Z-L. He was the founder of Zionism. He said that he was going to find the state that God promised the Jews. Listen to this very carefully. This man, Herzl, was an atheist. He had believed that there was no God. He said God did not exist. Now, how is it that a man who believes that God does not exist is going to find a state that God promised to his chosen people? I tell you, this man is Satan in disguise. Zionism is a satanic movement. It is devil. It is imperialism. It is racist. It has gone and taken the lands of the Palestinian people and through terrorism has driven them out. And through terrorism, it maintains its power. And the United States of America, with over 6 million homeless, sends to Israel billions and billions and billions of dollars everywhere to bomb Palestinian people while homeless people are here and unemployed are here. Zionism is going to raise this war and make the people of America become clear to what it is and become anti-Zionist and stop the aid to Israel and use the money to take care of the homeless in this country.
Also mentioned Zion.
All right, Kwame Ture, one of our founders as well as of our party, A-APRP, was discussing the origins of Zionism. Is often equated falsely with the religion of Judaism, but Zionism is a political ideology, right? The first Zionist conference was organized by Theodore Herzl, an atheist, on August 29th through 31st of 1997 in Basel, Switzerland. So Zionism sought to establish the state of Israel under public law, and it started with a few propositions. One of the ones that are commonly cited that has to do with Africa was the Uganda program. So it targeted Africa in its early years. This was proposed by the Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain, the Theodore Herzl's Zionist group, and it sought to give a portion of East Africa Protectorate, which was under the rule of the British. This land consisted of what is now modern Kenya as well as Uganda. And they offered 5,000 square miles in Maui escarpment, what is considered today Kenya. Herzl wanted Palestine originally and its surrounding areas such as Ottoman Syria, which that area is usually put in the graph when you see Greater Israel and what's supposed to be Greater Israel. Part of that has its foundation here. Some view the Uganda scheme, however, as a path to the Holy Land, which is under the Ottoman control. So they couldn't seize Palestine and Ottoman Syria originally because it was under control of the Ottomans. So therefore, many saw Uganda as a stepping stone to eventually getting towards Palestine. So the motion to consider the plan passed 295 to 177. Congress, however, ultimately decided to politely decline the British offer in 1905. Now, fast forward to the more modern era. In 1973, you had the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War saw Israel at war with Egypt, Syria, and soon afterwards Jordan. During this war, relations with newly independent African states began to go south. So originally, Israel had courted newly independent African states as a way to gain favor with African nations. After this conflict, however, a lot of those relations went south. A lot of African nations began to condemn Israel. And even the African diaspora, the Organization of African Unity, issued an official statement in 1973 condemning Israel's intrusions in Africa, mainly being Egypt. After this war, the facade of Israel's facade of friendliness towards Africa began to erode. So in 1976, Israel, IDF, the defense forces, and the Mossad agents invaded Uganda. They attacked a grounded plane in the Entebbe airport in Entebbe, Uganda. And Zionist media attempted to portray this as a heroic act, as if they were trying to rescue hostages. But Israel was trying to enact imperialist aggression in East African nations to enforce its, to spread its imperial influence within the region and to control many of the groups that were offering support to Palestine at the time. So an attempt to try to frame this as a heroic attempt or a heroic rescue, they produced movies such as 7 Days in Entebbe, and they remade this multiple times to kind of basically whitewash or to sanitize their actions. And they didn't just do this directly, they also incorporated actors within the region. A prominent one being the Mengistu regime of Ethiopia. So this regime had engaged in a war to prevent Eritrean independence. As Zionists sought to undermine Eritrean freedom fighters were working with the Palestine Liberation Organization. Thus, Israel saw Mengistu's regime as a key ally in helping to suppress this connection and suppress the freedom fighters. Israel supplied training and weaponry at a rate of 20 million annually to Ethiopia, and this assisted Ethiopia in also suppressing and terrorizing the Oromo resistance. So Zionists essentially established Ethiopia as their police officer in the region in the 70s. This helped lead to the destabilization of Somalia to repress resistance to the region. So Zionist media, Hollywood media, also helped create Black Hawk Down. This is a now infamous movie about the Somali freedom fighters taking U.S. Marines from a helicopter, dragging them through. I'm sure some of you have seen the pictures. The Somali villagers were dragging U.S. Marine through the village. So these were imperialist soldiers acting on behalf of the Zionists and the U.S. And they used media to portray this as a terrorist act when it was literally the natives of Somalia defending themselves and defending their land against imperialist forces trying to spread imperialist policy and destabilize their country. But it didn't stop in East Africa. We also saw Zionist involvement in West Africa. In 1989, Israel became a trainer, a benefactor of Charles Taylor's forces, which led for destabilization of Liberia. And this led to actually a freezing of ties between Libya and Liberia. So Libya, under Gaddafi, was at a very strong anti-Zionist stance. When Liberia became friendly with Israel, Libya went ahead and go ahead to freeze ties, and then Liberia responded by expelling Libyan representatives. And although Israel officially did try to not tie themselves to contributing to destabilization in the region and destabilization with conflict diamonds, there were many mercenaries aligned with Israel and aligned with the idea that were involved with weapons trade and training. One of them was Yair Klein, which was a very famous, prominent Israeli mercenary who was a high-ranking officer in the IDF forces. Imperialist and Zionist role for destabilizing the regions was also sanitized via movies like Blood Diamonds. So if you watch movies like Blood Diamonds, it made it seem like, oh, just Africans, killing each other, at war with each other, just tribalism over diamonds for resources, and that the West was just the benevolent actor just taking the diamonds to sell, right? Companies taking diamonds to sell. No, this was an active imperialist, active destabilization effort by Zionist forces and by imperialist Western forces in general. And then stop in West Africa, they also got involved in South Africa. So Israel originally was critical of apartheid through the 50s and 60s. Again, this is part of their branding attempts to gain favor with African nations. After the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where African nations broke ties with Israel, Israel began to build ties with apartheid South Africa. So again, mask was off, and they began to openly court the apartheid forces. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin hailed the South African Prime Minister John Vorster as a force for freedom in a state visit. This was ironic given the fact that Vorster was a former Nazi sympathizer and a commander of the fascist Oswald Brandwag that sided with Hitler. So Israel began to openly side with fascists, openly court fascists, and the Israel-South Africa actually became a leading weapons development, developer and enforcement of international arms trade. Israel consulted the South African army during the wars in Angola. So a lot of people don't know, but a major reason why apartheid was actually defeated was because the apartheid forces went to war with African nations in Angola. They went to war against the South African forces, the Angolan forces, and this is where Cuba got involved and sent their forces to aid. So Cuba was also helping, fighting alongside the Africans, and they defeated the South African army. And Israel was also central to the plots to development of South Africa's nuclear bombs. South Africa was able to actually successfully develop nuclear weapons, but after the apartheid government fell, the new Mandela government disarmed to the dismay of some Africans who wanted to keep the African nation nuclearized. So with that history, with that understanding of Zionism affecting Africans as well as affecting Palestinians, it comes to the logical conclusion that, well, Africans support Palestine, right? There's a materially vested interest in being against Zionism for Africans and Palestinians. South African president condemned Israel's current genocidal aggression in Gaza. Economic freedom fighters, which is the third largest party in South Africa, have gone so far as to call for arming the Palestinian resistance by South Africa. So far, South Africa and Chad have recalled ambassadors from Israel. I believe that has increased as well for some African nations, I'm sure. Djibouti and Somalia have also explicitly supported Palestinian liberation movements publicly. South Africa, as we know, has also presented its case of genocide by Israel to the International Court of Justice. And our party, the A-APRP, stands in full solidarity with Palestinian people against the genocidal Zionist entity. And for more about our party, this is our Twitter handle, @A-APRP, our Instagram, A-APRP International, and our website, aaprpinternational.org. We also have a sign-in sheet at the front near the cookies and the croissants that you would be able to sign in for. If any Africans who are involved in or interested in wanting to be involved with our org, we will reach out to you about orientation as well as to give out information. Again, the signing sheet is in the front page.
I think Alfred also did that same thing.
Yes, okay.
So yeah, we also wanted to open the floor up for discussion and questions. I did want to give a quick shout out to Midnight Books and Rearte for allowing us to host this space. It's great to have spaces like this to be able to host political events and for people to gather. There's not that many in the area, so for them to be here is honestly amazing. So yeah, and then I guess did anyone have any questions or any comments or anything that they wanted to share that they heard about?
I have an addition.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a wonderful presentation. But I'm pretty sure the Sahel states have all decided to cut ties with the Zionist entity as well in their move towards unification.
Yeah, I mean that could also be a formal states. Like I was those are the states I mentioned were those I knew formally off the top of my head, but there could be multiple more states that would be involved in this as well.
I was gonna add, I forgot to say it earlier, but when I was talking about like the initiation of Israel into creating and founding the state, I feel like there's like an inherent militarization that came with its founding, and you kind of see that with the requirement of Israeli citizens to serve 2 years in the IDF, and that kind of serves as a way to kind of make everyone in Israel who is an Israeli citizen a target, because ultimately you're part of the military, so you become a military target. At the same time, they get to sort of like, you know, there are people who are like, who have been captured or have been used as like hostages or have been killed in certain situations that the Israeli media likes to depict as a civilian. But in reality, by enforcing people, Israeli citizens, not only ideologically, but by actual action and enlisting in the military, you create them as a person within the country that doesn't have a civilian status anymore. And then there's even more to say about the fact that as being a settler within a colonial state, you kind of give up the status of being a civilian anymore. You kind of see that with, I can't remember, I don't know exactly what his name is, but that one fascist military guy who's like become prominently well known within Israel, who is seen passing out weapons to settlers within the West Bank. So there's a, what's his name?
I think it's Golan. I could be wrong.
Yeah,
it's Golani, yeah.
Yeah, Golani, yeah. And so just like a direct arming from like, you know, prominent military officials to the settlers within the regions, which we, you know, see in a lot of settler colonial states, which we saw within the United States in its inception as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, he's currently, I think, the actual equivalent of the defense minister. Right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. You had your hand raised?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to point out too that it's worth noting that aside from Nelson Mandela, Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary from Burkina Faso, who was unfortunately assassinated at the hands of the French and Western regimes, he even noted that like their freedom, the Burkinabe's freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians. So it's not the solidarity between Africans and Palestinians goes a long way back. It's not a new or common. It's not a new trend.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anybody else have any other questions, comments, anything they want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to say I've actually done a research paper on Africans and Palestinians. It was for a world history class. This was when I was a student at Cal State San Diego. And a lot of people don't know that historically the key movement Palestinians was Christians. Like the left Christian leader of George Bush, who created PFLP. The people who created Christianity are Africans. And a lot of people don't know this. That's why you have, like, you go to South Central, you see black churches. The old Western half, block after block. So I was trying to make sense of it. I said, hey, why don't I do a 25-page research on Africans and Palestinians? So I looked at it, and basically, Palestinian Christians are Africans. That was my conclusion after doing historical research. It's not like post-World War II. And historically, the Palestinian Christians organized the Palestinian resistance movement. PLO was that. The left groups, George Bush, PFLP was that. And also a lot of the Palestinian movement. The majority of Palestinians were Christians. The only place it wasn't like that was Gaza. Gaza has always been a Muslim, Palestinian Muslim area. And so this is an important thing that people don't make sense of it because its history's gone. But people who've done their research know that the Africans, Black Africa, created Christianity. And so the Palestinian Christian movement is essentially an African Palestinian.
Yeah. What are you gonna say? I was gonna say, I mean, historically, the region, right? Palestine's connected to Coptic Christianity, one of the earliest forms of Christianity. You obviously know Orthodox Christianity in Ethiopia as well as Christianity practiced in Syria. That region that has been denoted the Middle East by imperialist powers has historically been known as the Afro-Asiatic region. So it's been the connecting point between African and Asiatic cultures historically throughout the centuries. So Africans have been throughout that region as well as other Asian populations. There's a reason why a lot of Yemenis are also as well. I have a lot of African Yemenis as well. Yemen is literally right there by Djibouti and other neighboring African nations along the Red Sea, which is why they're blocking the Red Sea. It has a lot of African support, such as among other Horn of Africans such as Somalia and others, right? So African history and history within the Afro-Asiatic area, otherwise known as the Middle East, has been one of exchange for many centuries, and that's something that gets lost, right, when imperialists try to other the region when they talk about the Middle East, right? And when people talk about things such as Arabization, Arabs, it's often to lump everyone together, but the culture that they use in mind is usually connected to UAE, Dubai, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and from that area, right? The Gulf states, right? But the inter-exchange or the cultural exchange in the region between the various people, various populations is more beyond that. And other African scholars such as Dubois, Cheikh Anta Diop, and even Walter Rodney, right? How you're under the belt back there have talked about some of this exchange over years, right? So this is why it's been easy for African states as well as states in that area to develop solidarity, develop building and trade between each other's nations because of this issue that has been ongoing.
Yeah, so Palestinian Christians have always been part of the fabric of Palestinian culture. They've always been present. They're one of the oldest Christian communities in the world. And so there's always been, like King said, cultural exchange between East Africa and Palestine. And that being said as well, part of like a lot of the resistance movements that are going on with Hamas, with the Qassam brigades, are all Islamically led ideologically, and a big part of Islamic belief is belief in sort of like religious protection for people of the book. So Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Jews have always been protected under Islamic law, and they're a religious society in a way, but they've always, been amongst people of different faiths in Palestine. So, a Palestinian Christian and a Palestinian Muslim, there is no difference for them between one or the other. They're all people of the same history, of the same culture. They're their neighbors, they're their people, and Israel doesn't discriminate against a Palestinian Christian or a Palestinian Muslim. You do find, of course, that within Western media and Western propaganda, there is a concerted effort in pushing Islamophobic beliefs and stereotypes. Kind of see this big resurgence right now that gives me very post 9/11, vibes of the way things used to kind of were at that time. And the rhetoric that is just becoming so just normalized. But yeah, that's kind of to dispel that common belief.
I'm a little bit I'm interested in there was mention of the Ethiopian connection to like the counterbalance of the Eritrean resistance movement. Is that part of the reason that I've seen a number of Ethiopian Jews in the IDF and forces? Is there a connection between that, or is that separate, or is that were the Ethiopian Jews coming to Israel beforehand, or?
Well, there was after World War II, there was a large mass concerted effort of a Zionist movement to recruit or to bring in a lot of Jewish Middle Easterners, and mainly because to dispel, I think, partially the myth of it being, well, it's not the myth, it is, a European settler colonial project, but to create, just to move away from that idea, and partly push that there's like a worldwide anti-Semitism that's found within, Arab countries, within African countries. But if you look historically at the history of anti-Semitism, the reason why anti-Semitism came within Europe and rose is because of, European racialization, the creation of different races and classes, just the whole concept of race. So when you think a lot of people who identify as being Jewish, especially European Jews, they use it as a way, and this is newly found, this was like 100 years ago, European Jews would consider themselves Europeans. They're not going to consider themselves from Palestine. Right. So they started to kind of push the idea that they're indigenous to the Middle East and they have some connection to it, because that's based in a Nazi eugenicist belief that Jewish people are their own ethnic group, that they are of a different race, and that therefore they are genetically inferior, as Nazis wished everyone to believe or push that idea. So that's kind of part of it, and they wished to make anti-Semitism into this global phenomenon that occurred even in societies that didn't develop as Europe did. They didn't have this intense racialization. So that was part of that, and so there's lots of historical evidence to show the Mossad, especially within Middle Eastern countries, within Iraq, within Iran, creating reasons for Iranian Jews, for Iraqi Jews to flee their own homelands, to be able to find refuge, and that's whole part of the propaganda myth that the only place that Jews can be safe is within Israel. So it's further pushing that idea and further pushing for reasons for Jewish people to find solidarity within their identity of being Jewish as being solely synonymous with Zionism as well. So.
Go around the back.
You want to hear about history of Palestine? My name is Samir Fouad. I was born in Syria. And I came to the United States in 1982. And I have been working as a journalist. And I already studied Syria doctorate. And I have been working with in the last 40 years. And I can tell you about the history of what's presented today. It was pretty good, but it missed a lot of, there were a lot of gaps in the history of the conflict between the Zionists and the Arabs, including the Palestinians. So, coming back, the history of Palestine. In archaeology, it was proven, found in archaeology, that Palestine and Gaza in particular, are 5,000 years old. 5,000 years old. And the Palestinians are the original Semites of the area, first Semites ever in history. And whatever, later on talked about ancient Israelite and whatever, all of that came like 2,000 years later. It was already, there was Palestine and Gaza civilized centers where, early writings we found it was in the area between Syria, Palestine. That's where humanity started, civilization started. Before religion started, religion developed over worshipping some deities, and then later it came, Judaism, and later, 5,000 years later, and then Christianity, and then Islam. So, talking about the original Semites, who are the Palestinians, those are the people who continue to live continuously throughout history in the area. So you can say that today, the Palestinians of today are the Jews of yesterday, including Jesus Christ himself. He was a Palestinian Jew, and he spoke Aramaic. Aramaic is the early language of Arabic. The Palestinians and all Christians and Palestinians who lived, they identified themselves with Palestine as Christian when Jesus Christ came. And then later on, about 600, 650 years later, when Islam came from the Arabian Peninsula, Palestine became Muslim, and actually it was peacefully. The Caliph, second Caliph in Islam, Umar ibn Khattab, who came to Jerusalem, and the Christians gave him the keys to Jerusalem, and it was peacefully, and a lot of Christians, they converted to Islam, but it was peaceful. The one who remained Christian in Palestine, and they were throughout history some Jews, but actually they were not persecuted by the Palestinians or the Arabs or the Muslims. The one who did it are the Romans, like 2,000 years ago. They persecuted the Jews and they scattered all over the place. And later on, I mean, when we talk about now Jews in Europe, those Jews in Europe are not really Semites. The Jews we're talking about, they divide between Sephardim and Ashkenazi. The Sephardim, those are Spanish Jews, and those lived with the Arabs when the Arabs and Syrians were the leaders in the 7th century. From the 7th century until the 15th century, ruled Spain. And the Muslims were along with the Jews. They were living peacefully and no problem with them. The problem started when the Christians in Spain, they started the Inquisition and they kicked out the Arabs and the Jews together out of Spain. So now we are talking about when they were out, like in 1492. That's the time when Columbus supposedly discovered America. That was the time when the Arab rule in Spain ended, and it was called Andalusia, and it was big civilization, the golden civilization in Europe during that time. While I'm in Europe, it was in the Dark Ages at that time. Now we're talking about those Jews in Germany and Poland. Those are not Sephardim. Those are Ashkenazi Jews who came from Russia, from the Russian state, the Khazari Jews they call them. They moved into Western Europe, to Germany and Poland, and settled. So actually they were not Semites. They never been Semites. And the actual Jews, I mean, who scattered after 1492, they went back to Morocco, to Palestine, to Syria, to Egypt, to Iraq, to Tunisia, all the Arab countries, and they took them back. And they were safe and fine, I mean, living with the Muslim and Arab country all along. The only time, I mean, they were, now we're talking about Germany during Hitler time. The term anti-Semitic was really wrong. I mean. It was created to identify that the Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, as Semitic, and they were really not Semitic. The real Semites are already out of Europe, and they are living in different Arab countries, and they are fine, and they have no problem with the Arabs or the Muslims or the Palestinians, including Palestine. But they were minority, but they were safe. And the persecution started in Europe, and against all Jews and under the term anti-Semitic, but in reality, they were Germans, they were European. And after the Second World War, supposedly, they should come back to Germany after defeating Nazism.
Yeah.
Those were Germans and Polish. German and Polish people. I mean, they happen to be Jewish, so what? But they belong there. They should have came back over there. No. England and France and the United States, they were the winners, the Allies, after 1945. They decided, oh no, we have to send all the Jews to Palestine and let them have a homeland in Palestine, and that Prime Minister Balfour, British Prime Minister, already promised the Jews in 1917, 1916, November 1917, that you will have Palestine as a Jewish homeland, but he could not do it because the Jews were in Palestine at that time in 1917, like 6% of the population. The vast majority were Palestinian Christians and Muslims. So he couldn't do it. So he waited until after the Second World War to do that, to push hundreds of thousands of those Jewish refugees to Palestine. And in 1948, they have like 600,000, while the Palestinians were 1.5 million. And they decided, okay, in 1948, we're going to kick the Palestinians out and kill, and they committed many massacres, among them the Yasin famous massacre. They massacred children and women and whatever. That was in 1948, and they created Israel. And they called the Nakba, and that was in Arabic Nakba, means disaster to the Palestinians. So the whole story now, I'm talking about Palestine and Zionism. The Zionists created the Zionist state called Israel. It's an artificial entity, and it does not belong to the area. And who are the rulers of this Israel? Not the Oriental Jews or Sephardim, no, the Ashkenazi, the European. European Jews, all their prime minister since 1948, the inception of Israel, until today, always they are in control. And they never really felt like they are part of the area, except, they are saying that we are superior. And they talk in the name of Jews and the name of all Israelis, but actually they were rejected by the Palestinians to begin with, because they came to Palestine and stole Palestine furnished. Palestine before 1948 it was a civilized center, and like they have airports, they have buses, they have schools, they have churches, they have mosques, they have university. Here comes those new immigrants, Jewish immigrants, supposedly to live, coexist. If they were good people, they should have, they were guests to Palestine. They should have lived in one democratic state in Palestine instead of creating that artificial state in 1948 and be hostile to the whole neighborhood and to the Palestinians themselves. And that's why they kept the war from 1948 in a state of war. They knew, those Israelis, that they stole that land furnished. They stole Palestine furnished with everything, even the culture, the food, everything. And they still, after 75 years, they are not welcomed in the Arab world. They are, it's a pariah state. And now, after October 7, the world get to know the Americans, especially. They were brainwashed over the last 75 years, and there was the Israeli-American lobby working with buying all members of Congress and brainwash the American people. And suddenly, now the American people, oh, there's Palestine. They never heard of Palestine. And the American Congress and administration, they were surprised. Oh my God, all of these now Americans demonstrating for Palestine. They didn't think that, it was like they lied to the American people all along, and they thought that every generation, American generation, will just follow what the earlier generation, and they will forget about Palestine and fully Israel. They found out that's not true. Palestine is still there, and Palestine is still waiting, and Palestine is still willing to have peace with the Palestinians, to coexist in one secular democratic state.
That was great input for us, for our program. Right now we have 2 more videos we'd like to go over, 2 more screenings we'd like to go over, and then there can be mingling commentary, but now for our program we have 2 more screenings, and one of them is 5 minutes,